We're gonna do this again. Here we go. Okay. Let's move on to episode 3, right? We've done episode 1, which I took us through that backstory, like weight gain, how it all happened, how we end up here, right? Now I've done episode 2, right? More so in depth about the actual weight loss portion, what that looked like, especially in our summer, right? We're gonna take our time back, because this is episode 3. The thing with episode 3 is, into this one, as we get closer to the actual surgery date, my goal for this one is to talk more about the darker aspects of both weight gain, and weight loss, because there are those, and they are important aspects to consider. Now, I'm of the belief, like I said before, you do not get to 400 pounds, and usually is without some sort of thing you're dealing with. Whatever that may be, can be a multitude of things. But let's look at, for me, right? Injured leg, that didn't help in high school after I sprained my ankle. So that would help. But before then, I was already still pretty big. And one of the things to look at is food became a coping mechanism from like my early on teenage years and up into high school, right? I used it to cope with a lot of things. And alongside with that, especially with my faith, and there were times where, I wouldn't say full on doubts, but I did not explore my faith as I should have. As being a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, and growing as Jehovah's Witness, I didn't really dive into it as I could. And so I use food as that coping mechanism. I use that to clutch on at certain aspects. And, well, did it backfire? Being a big old fatty. That'll help. And so, and in those times, right? And some of it is also not just purely coping. And it has its attachment too, based on, as a society, we do it for celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, going out, sometimes a reward for many different things growing up. Also growing up not in the most financially affluent situation, right? Sometimes it was a reward, can be, especially buffets. Like I said, Golden Corral hated to see me coming, but for doing tasks or chores that alleviated the stress from my parents. Now I go back into that coping mechanism, right? So it kind of transferred. Peanut butter for me. Love me a good old, didn't matter. Could have been peanut butter sandwich, could have been Reese's, could have been Uncrustables, peanut butter chocolate ice cream, doesn't matter. They had peanut butter in it, it was get eaten, right? And that was one of those things, right? I can eat an entire jar, the one that's about 32 servings, in approximately 2 days. That's very fast, right? And so diving into that, and you realize that that can be a foundation of such large weight gain, you have to do a lot of introspection. And so during that summer, being not alone, but living on campus during my internship and cutting things out like that and sweet tea, there was no coping with sweet tea. I just really love sweet tea, right? You realize, or I began to realize that, okay, there's this attachment piece here. And now that I've removed it, there's a lot of emotional things that will come up. And that is true for a lot of weight loss, right? And so dealing with that, I found it a lot harder, but it made losing weight a lot easier. And it didn't help that during that time, I started to realize physics was not the track for me, and I was having a career crisis, right? I was being on my own for the first time. I didn't really have a car. It was not one for making friends because I don't really talk to people, honestly. Not easy to talk to and get along with, but I usually don't go out of my way. So all of those started to compile together, and when you don't have that mechanism, it can make those things quite challenging. And so I had to find different ways of eating and learning how to eat and learning how to train. And so all of that came to the surface, right? And not to mention physically, I was uncomfortable, just being large while trying to lose weight. And so now we separated that, right? We've gone past the coping. We've gone past that. And we get past the, large amounts of weight loss. We learn to deal with that, okay? Well, there's still some other aspects of that. I mentioned like buffets and things of nature, or like the Bojangles, right? That would bring up something that I've never been diagnosed with. Never talked to anyone about it. To be diagnosed. But I had to have had some sort of binging going on. And there were times where it was very noticeable, right? Eating later at night in large copious amounts of food definitely didn't help, even under certain, I wouldn't call it restrictions. I would say I actually just went through a diet change where I decided to actually change my eating habits. But even within those eating habits, doesn't mean you still can't overeat on some of the healthier things. Like instead of just eating a large pizza, you eat 6 baked chicken breasts, which does add up over time, right? And so navigating that and understanding that this is something that is the more darker aspects when it comes to weight gain and weight loss. And that's why I truly believe if we saw food like we treated like every other drug or alcohol, the conversation would look different. The only thing is you need food to survive. And while going through that, and while figuring out during that summertime, you start to get to the aspect when you're changing that nature and you're starting to change all those, like, okay, that's great, wonderful. But then this is where family and friends can start to come in. And I say this with love and sometimes with actual just stoicism. You will have to cut people off. You will have to straight up ignore them, or you may have to just block them, do whatever. Some will come around and they will recognize that. And this could be because as you begin to go through these changes and you begin to lose the weight and you begin to understand things about yourself and how diet, nutrition, and physical fitness is important, a lot of those habits I mentioned, like I said, come from familiar situations, ceremoniously, or the connection that was built there. And that isn't always easy for family and friends to accept, especially if they also have a very similar unhealthy background. Usually what that means is it can reveal a lot about them, and you now become a reflection of what they are unwilling to do. And that is a hard pill to swallow for some people, especially among family members. And if you grow up in a household, I can't speak for anyone else, but especially like black households, like denying like certain things like fried food, it becomes a point of contention, right? And you either just have to make your own food, show up, don't show up, or honestly just tell everybody to screw off and figure out the rest for your life. And that isn't always easy for every party, and some will come around, like I said. But it is sometimes the necessity of when you're trying to move in the right direction, when you're trying to have a healthier lifestyle, it becomes to a point where you have to be like, I truly don't care if we are related, because you are doing nothing more than standing in my way. And this becomes true with friends as well, because as you are on college or you're in college on campus, right, you know, for me, I'm going to tell you something. Grew up in the Southeast, Columbia, South Carolina, University of South Carolina. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of us that know about the glorious cookout. I'm not going to say I always said no, because I did, because I didn't. But you go to cookout and get a big double burger tray at 1 a.m, look. Sometimes it happens. Other times, well, you might actually have to say no. Like I said, sometimes it happens. Other times you might have to say no. But also what comes along with that is, just like with friends, you may have to tell family, because they may not always understand that you can't always eat when you go somewhere, or you simply cannot go somewhere, right? There may be certain parties, or there may be certain, whether it be work parties or work meetings and family parties that I can't go to because I know what foods will be there, and simply being in that area is enough for me. You don't have all the willpower all the time. That's not how it works, especially if you are, it's been a long day, you're tired, everyone's annoyed you, right? Sometimes you will just eat an entire sleeve of cookies because it's there. But if you don't go or you don't buy things, that's how it happens. Until you've learned, right? Or until you're able to build that tolerance. Or maybe you never do, and you have to find ways around that. Maybe you bring your own food, right? Maybe you substitute that urge to eat whatever it is with something familiar tasting, right? But not in the same realm. Because, once again, we treated food like we treated drugs. We would understand that you can't always just be around that. And bringing your own food isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people make things that aren't just healthy. Or you truly just don't want it. That's ultimately the ending goal, is to not simply, I can't have this. I think that becomes very bad on the psyche. But get to a point where I don't want this. That's where it becomes easier to be in the same room. Like I said, because willpower is no longer a factor. You just simply don't want it. But takes time to get to that point. And so I've talked about coping mechanisms, and I've talked about how to deal with, deal with fans and family, right? Like I said, cutting them off usually is the hardest one, but sometimes what you have to do. And then ultimately dealing with the actual mechanism of dealing with food and how to understand that. But going up through this time, that summer, I realized there was a lot of things that I had to come to terms with. And then by the time I got 21, 22, moved on my own, so I had to start all that all over again, make new friends, new college campus, new state, new way of dealing with things, and like, all right, well, the stressors are back up, that's great. So, also navigating that. But I had already lost most of the weight, right? I was pretty much already, by that time, 260, and then I made my way to doing bodybuilding stuff, kind of figuring that part out when I got down to 222, which was very light and probably won't really do that again purposefully. I stayed comfortably between like 235 and 245 at the moment. But getting there, we get to, once again, not self-diagnosing, but a lot of the signs and symptoms are there. Will be viewed as like body dysmorphia. And sometimes you're like, oh, that's cool, I got muscles, I'm a big person. And then sometimes you're like, oh, that's cool, I'm a big person, and there's skin flaps. Right. Which, in a way, does bother me, but in a way, I do appreciate, because it's almost like a visible scar, or a kind of like a trademark for me of the hard work I've been through, of all the effort I put in. And that was a really good thing. It's something I actually really enjoy. And so the skin being one of the last of the big things to topple is one of those things that, I think I've been patient enough, and I've waited long enough, and I can actually, I think we're at the point where getting removed is the final steps. That is where I would see the end part of the fruition of the years of the effort and years of trial and the journey I've been on. Granted, once it's actually gone and I've been chopped up, the effort's still not done. The fitness journey doesn't end; it's forever going. But now I have to deal with quote unquote reconstruction, rehabilitation, getting back to the fitness realm, right? Getting back into practicing jiu-jitsu, but that's down the line, and competing, and then seeing how bodybuilding looks from there. But it is more of this is near the end of the grand schemes of moving at the end part of that fitness journey. And so the skin is just kind of like that last portion of it. So, and it, like I said, say it doesn't play any bit on the psyche is wrong, especially as you do want to see muscles, or at least for me, in the shoulders and arms, which really aren't a problem, in my chest and legs and abs. That was also very odd, right? Seeing abs for the first time, even with all the skin there, was a unique experience. And so these are all the dark aspects of it. But with that last portion comes with the actual surgery piece. I say that because I am not always a very trusting person. So the idea that I have to give a surgeon, which I've had surgeons before, but they're like 20 minutes, 30 minutes tops. And they poke something in my ear, right? But to give someone and people, me, unconscious, for about 3 hours, where they are chopping and snipping and like flipping me back and forth, that is not something I take lightly. And something I have also heavily considered, because I know they spend a lot of time doing this and preparing for this, but it is still a scary thing. I've never been under that long. Nearly, at minimum 2 hours? Going up to 4, maybe? It's a long time for me to be under, right? And so that is now something I am dealing with as I draw closer is this is a fear of mine. I'm like, look, you sure y'all can pick me up? I'm afraid I'm not exactly the lightest person. And then also, in doing my research, it's kind of funny, but also kind of scary. Because I'll see those clips of like the skin being removed. And I don't know how I feel about them playing with the skin flaps. I truly don't know how I feel about that. But like, nope, I don't have a response. That's it. But like, in all seriousness though, all in all, like I said, the dark portions of this, I don't want to make this terribly long, is simply that large weight gain and weight loss can stem from something. And usually some sort of event changes that. For me, I went to stop sweating so much. That's not what happened, but it happened. Dealing with things growing up through childhood up into adulthood, you make food your coping mechanism. And you realize once you take that away, you have to figure out things can be better. Spiritually, and I think that's what we go with, right? But in terms of other instances of how to deal with that, we don't want to drive to other things. It's easy to go from food to alcohol or food to drug. We find other things, or extreme exercising, and that plays into the dysmorphia aspect. And now we have the way we view our body, and to the point where we now have taken the food away, which we could have binged in, until now we have binging tendencies, now smaller, but we overcompensate with exercise. So not to conflict all of those things. Also, to sum that up, in the midst of all this, navigating relationships, as there are those who will either be jealous, envious to a point, or just straight up saboteurs, or those who don't truly understand and don't recognize they're in the way, and gently you can let them know. But ultimately finding trust becomes very important in just letting people know, including the actual doctors that you're dealing with when it comes to getting your skin flaps chopped off. So, all to say, as we continue into the episodes, and I'm very curious to see as when we get as far as to what the actual surgery looks like. Now, there will be no camera in the surgery room, for those wondering, right? But befores and after, well, we've seen plenty of befores, what I look like now, but like truly after, right? Because then we move into rehabilitation, right? We move into structuring and far past that, like phase 5 and phase 6, right? Athletic performance. We build that back up. But once I actually get close to the date, and I know that's about the shortest phase 3, which is the operation phase, essentially, right? I'm at the point where now my meals are dialed in. Did my camera just die? Man, I know you fucking lying. Anyway, now my camera decided to die on me. As I was saying, the chopped up portion, trusting people, near the end, right? Phase 3, going to operation phase, right? We're getting closer to that. Just essentially how ending all this off before I start recording all of those next portions, ramping up what I'm talking about in terms of my training, nutrition, prepping for that, but also seeing how that's going to look. That is what I'm most interested about. And then hopefully, I can get permission. We're getting there. Talk to my surgeon, have certain clips come up, certain pictures. I might have to trust someone to record those. We'll see. But once again, through all of this, I hope I'm able to relay information that you can all relate to, learn something from, and also follow on this journey with me. There's a lot that goes on here, and there's a lot to encounter. And as you continue to watch, I hope this gets interesting.